Today we're going to be talking about the calendar component. I should probably quit Slack so I don't get interrupted. And I'm going to launch a example here. Okay, so this should be a fun demo for even people that have experience with this component, because we're also going to talk about how to add an extension to the component. So first, let's cover the basics. Pretty much you drag and drop this component on a form, and you have to feed it some information and some configuration, including events, which are the actual event bubbles that show up on the calendar, and some configurations about what views you want to have, what you want to have in the header bar here, etc. So we'll go through that a bit. Just the default here, I just put a few events on a calendar, and we're looking at it in month view. We can switch to week view or day view. You can see that when I go to day view, I have some resources shown here. This is an extension that has the vertical resource view, and we'll talk about that in a minute or in a few minutes. But looking at the week view here, you can see that I can drag events. I can resize them so I can change their duration. I can also click on an event, and you can see I have a custom editor here that I built as a regular form in Servoy, and I could say change the title and push that back into the calendar. So with this basic example, you can probably imagine how you want to hook this up to data and run with it. So the next example I'll show is how to make this data bound. So in the data bound example, we go to good old fashioned example database, the Northwinds data, with the orders coming from the 90s. So you can see that I have set the calendar to this month, but back in 1997. So we get the orders showing up here, and I'm just pulling that data out of the database. The nice thing about this approach is in the first example, I just kind of programmatically stuck a few events on the calendar, but here I'm actually feeding the events to the component from the server as needed. So as I page to the prior month or the next month, or I go through the weeks, these are all at midnight, by the way, just because, or I guess at noon, just because of they don't really have a time associated. But as you see that as I scroll through, excuse me, it's paging in those events from the server. So we'll take a look at how to set that up as well. Lastly, I want to look at what we're calling a scheduler view. This is an extension to the calendar component that it is a paid extension, not from Servoy. This is a third-party component. So if you have a proper license, and you can see that I do not, because it's showing up the please use valid license key down here, but it's easy to use with a trial. But if you have the license key, you can go into the scheduler view, and you can see that I have a, this is called a timeline view, and I have it broken up by resources. So again, I'm pulling data from the database, and I'm looking at 1997, but if these events actually had some times other than 12 p.m., we would see those events staggered about in, you can move them around just the same. You could even change resources. In this case, I selected the shipper as the resource, but you can drag the events around and then update your data with that, and vice versa. If I switch to this is called the vertical resource view. So we have timeline and vertical resource view. You can see that the shippers are shown as columns, and I'm looking at a single day. Of course, all of this is configurable. I could look at Monday through Friday and still have the groups of the resources. But in this case, I'm just looking at a single day, and you can see that as I scroll through the days, I get, excuse me, the events showing for the particular resource. And again, I could drag those, change the resource. That would actually could change the shipper in the back end if I wanted to. So a nice use case of this would be you're managing a warehouse, and you have shipments coming in and going out, and you need to schedule when that's happening per shipping dock. And so we have customers with ERP applications that are doing just that and using this extension. So we'll take a look at how to set that up as well. So let's go under the hood and look at the first example, the basic example. I will close all of these, and for some reason I'm in the debugger because I was, of course, working on this in the last minutes. There we go. So I have a form called basic example, and I'm going to open this in the form editor. And the way that I set this up is I drag the full calendar onto the form, and pretty much away we go. When you look at the properties, there's not much you need to set here really, except for if you want to handle some of the events, you can put those in as bindings. Also, if you want to handle the layout here, which I've done, just made it full size, you can do that. There is some ability to add CSS, and there's also a tooltip expression builder, but I don't have a demo for that one. But you can make dynamic tooltips, as you can imagine, that get passed down into the client. So what I've done here, if we open this in the code editor, now I'm overriding a base form. So I'm just sort of piecing out functionality of this to the subforms that I've created for those 3 examples, but we can go into the base form as well. But I want to first talk about the event objects that we put into the calendar. So this method get event source gets called when the calendar is being set up, and you can see that it's pretty simple. It's just an object with an array called events, and I just pass in some information, some configuration about the events. So the key pieces of information are the title that gets shown, the start date, and the end date. You can also have the option for all day events, which I've put for false here. You can see that the color is blue. That's for the whole series or the whole source of events, so all 3 of them, but that could be overridden by one of these options here. Now, when we go into the base form, you can see that if we go right to the very first time this is shown, I'm calling a method init calendar, and here's really all you have to do to set it up is call this full calendar method and pass in options. And then what I did is I added the events here, which called that method to get the events. If we look at the options, it's just a configuration object, and you can set it up with sort of like a JSON syntax. But what I did is I just made the object here and added the type tag for the full calendar options, because then you get nice code complete, and you can see that as I start typing, I get all of the options that I can pass into that calendar for configuration. For example, I chose what to put in the header, and these are the views that I'm supporting. And this is in the base form, so this gets inherited, but later I overrode that for the scheduler view. I wanted all the calendars to be editable, so these allowed me to click the events, drag around. I can also select in the white space of the calendar if I wanted to make a new event. So by enabling this, I get those event callbacks that I set up. Finally, I add the resources. Now, the resources were in the simple example, they were just some that I made up. In the data-bound example, they were the shippers. So again, I'm using a bit of form inheritance here, and if we look at the basic example, I did override get resources, and you can see that again, this is just an array of simple objects, but you can have some nesting as well. So in the simplest form, it's just an ID and a title. But you can also have some nesting, which when you go in the timeline view, it shows up as a tree, which I didn't have with the shippers, but I can show you that. You can see that in the events, this is how we get bound to the event. We just, this one here, we pass in the resource ID, and that's what links it. You can also have colors for your resources. So if you wanted, all of one shipper to show up in blue and another one to show up in green, if you put it on the resource, then you can override it on the event, but it'll inherit it from the resource. So there's a lot you can do just with events and resources. So that's really a simple example. I just did the calendar options, the configuration, the events, and then the resources, and that's how I got this one. If we look at the data bound option, remember these are paged in from the server, and this is probably the way most people will use it. So I think it's important to show how this works. Again, I used form inheritance. So in the data bound example, if I open this in script editor, the form layout is exactly the same, by the way. So I override the get event source method again, which then gets passed into the calendar in the base form. And here the difference is, instead of just giving an array of event objects, I'm actually passing in a little bit of configuration and then a callback method, fetch events, which gets called every time the calendar needs to load more events. So this method gets called for you, for example, when you're scrolling through the days, weeks, or months, and it passes in the start and end for the range that you're looking at. Also, there can be a data object, which is custom, which you could apply some sort of filter. But I'm not using that in this case. So here I create a simple query object. In the results of the query, these are the things that I want to show in the event. And in the where clause, I'm putting in that it's greater than, it's between the start and the end date, basically. I get my data set by query, and then I build the events programmatically just by pushing them into an array. And here is where I'm linking that event to the shipper. So the resource ID is coming from this one here, which is a foreign key column to the shipper. Now, that just gives me the ID. So a little farther down, I've also overridden the get resources method. And in this case, I'm just going out once and getting the shippers. I have a value list already set up from example data. And so I just get that, and that's really a list of ID and display, which is exactly what I need for the resources. So I just iterate over that value list, and you can see that I'm pushing in that simple object to load the resources. So I override those two methods. It's fairly straightforward. Another thing I did is I overrode the init calendar, and I just told the calendar to jump to a date. I use this go to date method because all of the example data is really old, so I wanted to just go to 1997, and then there's a bunch of events there so that we don't have to scroll. Another thing that I didn't show is that when I click one of these, I actually am showing the order detail. So again, I'm loading the data now. So let's look at how we did that. I overrode the on event click handler, and I created a little form called order detail, and I pass in this event object. And pretty much I just load the found set with the ID of the event object because that's all I'm interested in, and then I show it in a modal dialog. Of course, if I'm editing it, I have to pass it back, and I can show you that example from the basic one, because I didn't really do that. So in the basic one, you'll see that when I click here, I was able to, I could move the date, and I can change this. Click OK, and you can see that it's updated here. In the basic example, when I handle the on event click, oh, that's in the base form. I overrode it here in basic example, right here. I had another little form called event editor, and I do the same thing. I pass in the event object, but in this case, I copy those properties into form variables. Then I show the dialog. Then if the user clicked OK, I return back this object. And back in the basic example form, this is where the event gets pushed back into the calendar. I call elements.calendar.update event. So you can programmatically update an event that's been edited. So I would take the same approach if I was editing a record and say I rescheduled the order or changed the shipper and I wanted to show in a different resource. I would just pass in, sort of convert that event object back in and pass it into the calendar. I can update it directly there. So that's pretty much the data bound example. And then finally, we had the scheduler view where we have both the timeline view here, which shows resources on the left and the blocks on the right. And we have the vertical resource view, as it's called, which shows the resources as columns. So this is part of the extension. And so here's sort of an example of how to set this up. Now, everything I showed you up until the scheduler example works fine out of the box, but you actually have to go and download the scheduler from Full Calendar and then plug it in. So, and we have documentation on the wiki for that, but basically what I do is I go out onto the Full Calendar website, and you can see there's a scheduler plugin here, and basically need to get the download from here, and you get a little zip file with a JavaScript file and a CSS file, and all I did is put those into my media. And there's two things you have to do. One is you have to import the CSS. So if you look at the CSS file for the whole solution, I have something called calendar CSS, and I import the scheduler CSS. It's right there. I copied it into the media folder. Then the other thing I have to do is I have to inject the JavaScript file. And there's a little trick for that. If I look at the onSolutionOpen event, so when this application loads, I call add.js file dependency, and I have a method here which just injects that using the ng-client-utils plugin, creates a little tag. And this is a standard way to do this, and I believe this might even be in the SVY-utils library, so you don't even have to write this method yourself. I will make this solution available on the forum after the webinar, so you don't need to memorize all this, but pretty much you add the scheduler JavaScript file by injecting it on startup, and you add the style sheet through an import on the CSS file for the solution. That puts all the dependencies you need there, and then finally you want to show those views. I have the scheduler example here. If I look at the get options where I overrode the get, this is all the only code I added to the scheduler one is I sort of overrode the header where I was saying what views show, and I added timeline day and agenda day, and agenda day automatically shows up instead of the regular day view as the vertical resource view. And so that's really all you have to do to set it up. There's also adding the license key. This is just sort of like the trial license, but you would get, if you purchased it, you would get the commercial license and plug it in there. One thing that I wanted to show you was also the resources with the hierarchy. If I add these back to the base form so that it's everywhere on the get options. I'm going to just relaunch this. Now when I go to, it's a bit confusing because they're all named the same, but now when I look at, I believe it would be this one, there we go. Now you can see that there is a collapsible group here. So if you have hierarchies, you just add remember you add the children in the resource and it shows up grouped like this, so you can really get specific with how you group events.